Myerly. I'm a doctor of military history, and the lecture I'm giving today is entitled America, Islam, Arabs up to 1817, Piracy, Slavery, and the USA's First Middle East War. Now, in the history of relations between Europe and the Middle East, the Islamic Middle East, the mentality of Europeans towards Islam has been traditionally characterized by a great deal of ignorance. Europeans believed that Muslims worshipped the Greek god Apollo, the Greek goddess Diana, or Satan, or the Greek philosopher Plato, and some thought that Muhammad was the Antichrist. Others thought that Islam was a Christian heresy or a fake religion. It shares the idea of one God with Christianity, but much of the Middle East life is significantly different than it was in Europe at the time. In Islam, there was no formal religious hierarchy in Islam. The Middle East had great cities, and Islam did not have monks, and yet Muslims were more learned than Christians. And the Bible was little help in understanding the differences of Christians. Many felt that Islam was a danger to them and contaminated. In fact, they were afraid of it. It was also not unusual for people to think that Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, was some sort of magician or wizard. He had destroyed Christianity of the Greek Orthodox Church by evil magic. The notion that Muhammad is the God of Islam, or a Christ-like Savior, still persists after 1,400 years from the present. One of the factors that perhaps made this ignorance worse, or did not alleviate it, I should say, is that conversions between Islam and Christianity were almost all from Christianity to Islam. And for many centuries, those who converted to Islam did not convert back to Christianity, because if they did, they were often killed by their rulers. Islam does make Christians uneasy about their own beliefs as well. And as we shall see, Europeans and later Americans often tended to see Islam more as a reflection of their own fears and concerns and their own conflicts, internal fears, concerns, and conflicts, than looking at it and understanding it as a separate belief system. Now, there's a significant contrast between Christianity and Islam. Christians are often, in the Middle Ages especially, intolerant to the point of mass slaughter of their enemies. And not just of infidels, not just of those who believe something different than themselves, but even of their own people, if they were suspected of believing a different version of Christianity than the official version that was accepted where they lived. It's also significant that traditionally Jews fared much better under Islamic states than under Christian states in the Middle Ages. In Europe, Jews could not own land. They were frequently persecuted. They were charged with such things as eating Christian babies, drinking their blood. The occasion of the Black Death in the 14th century was also blamed on Jews as a form of black magic. In Islam, by contrast, Jews as well as Christians were considered people of the book. Now, historically, Jews have been disliked in the Middle East, but they were not persecuted like they were in Europe. And they were also allowed to control their own areas through their own judges. Another significant difference in the Middle Ages and in subsequent centuries between Islam and Christianity is the treatment of women. Under traditional Christianity, European women generally had no right to keep their dowry after they got married. Their husband, in fact, kept their dowry. There was no real divorce available until the 20th century. In the country that most affected American institutions and American culture, England, it was actually legal for a man to sell his wife up to the year 1825. And on marriage, traditionally in England, the husband automatically acquired all of his wife's property. It was also perfectly legal for him to beat her. In fact, the old expression, rule of thumb, what that meant was that the man could beat his wife legally with a stick no bigger than the wife's part of his thumb. It was even legal for a husband to prevent his wife from seeing her own children. He got to keep all of her property, including any wages she might earn after they may have separated. And she literally had no existence except under her father or her husband's control. Now, in Islam, this is quite different. Women acquired basic rights with the advent of Islam. They could and still keep their own names upon marriage. Divorce is relatively easy. And women also have always had the right to keep and control their own dowries. And this was even true in the Middle Ages for women who were purchased as slaves for marriage. They had the right to keep the dowry. Women also under Islam have the right to be their husband's heir. Now, there have been exceptions to this. Yes, there have been exceptions on both sides, both in Christianity and Islam. Especially when these exceptions were continuations of older customs. However, it's very significant that legal rights are a fundamental indication of status in any society. Now, the contrast between Islam and Christianity in terms of learning is also quite dramatic. Christianity fundamentally feared learning well into the 19th century. In the Middle Ages, people were actually killed for reading forbidden books. Islam, by contrast, encouraged the reading of the Quran. However, there was a tendency in later centuries to exclude other books for the exclusive concentration on the Quran. But in the 8th and 10th centuries, the foundations of modern history and science were laid by Islamic scholars. In fact, there would be no modern science without the work that these Islamic scholars did, because these, especially Arab and Persian scholars, digested all of the information that had been, and the learning that had been developed by ancient Greeks, and established modern science on the foundation of their conclusions and their study of Greek science. Europeans, by contrast, only slowly adopted Islamic science. But in doing so, they tended to remain profoundly ignorant of Islam as a religion. There was some Islamic impact on Christianity in the 13th century, but in the 15th century, there was no known European who could actually read Arabic. Now, in terms of the conflicts, military conflicts between these two great religions and their cultures, the early Islamic expansion, Muslim Arabs made war on the very corrupt Byzantine and Persian governments in the Middle East. They made war on the governments and not on the people. In fact, many people in these areas converted to Islam, and even non-Muslims supported the invasions of Muslim armies to overthrow their corrupt governments. By the late 11th century, however, Europeans, from increased population and increased wealth, launched invasions of the Middle East known as the Crusades. What happened is that there were many unemployed knights in Europe at the time, and each one of them was absolutely convinced that he deserved to live well. And there were simply too many knights, and what happened is that they went around abusing people, robbing people, and they tended to make wars worse because there was so many fighting available. So what happened is that on the false belief that Muslims were preventing Christians from getting access to the Holy Land, which was actually not true because they only could not get access because of internal Muslim conflicts between different Muslim governments, especially the Sunni government in Baghdad, the Shia government in Egypt. The Christian Pope granted indulgences to knights who would go on crusades in the Middle East, which basically meant that they could get an indulgence which would absolve them of all the crimes they may have committed in the past if they left Europe and invaded the Middle East. It's a way to get rid of these characters. Now, in these crusades, the crusaders were notorious for their extreme violence. The usual notion Americans have of crusades is that this is some sort of holy mission on the part of Christians. In fact, this was an extremely violent invasion. And the first crusade, which ended in the year 1099 with the siege of Jerusalem, the Christians decided the best thing to do would be to put the entire city to death. Greek Orthodox Christians, Jews, and Muslims. One crusader later noted that he waded up to his knees in human blood. And then after they won their victory, the Christians went to the holiest church in Christendom, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and gave thanks to God for their great victory. That's the kind of people that these crusaders were. Now, another dimension of the Crusades, which was even longer, was the Spanish Reconquista. By the way, this is, I don't know how we can see it as a map of the Maghreb, North Africa, the Maghreb in Arabic. Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Derna, which I'll be talking about. Here's Iberia, Spain, and Portugal up there. Now, the started with North African Moors invading Spain in the 8th century. In this invasion, the Jews of Iberia were very eager to assist the Islamic invasion because they were being persecuted by the Christians. There were also many of the German immigrants in northeastern Europe, the Visigoths, that converted to Islam in the course of these invasions. The Moors then built the most advanced civilization in the entire world in the Kingdom of Granada. Most advanced in a number of ways, and their architecture and art is quite stunning. However, the Christians in Spain and the Portuguese gradually gained ground over the Muslims, and by the year 1492, the Christians had reconquered all of Iberia. This conquest was characterized by extreme destruction. For example, the Muslims had built the extremely elaborate Andalusian water system in southern Spain. The Christians simply wasted this. In fact, one scholar of the area, Llewellyn Hall, an American, has noted, quote, the fanatical intolerance and bigotry of the Spanish monarchs. So the leaders of the Spanish Reconquista were not very nice people. They persecuted Arabs and Jews, but they also persecuted their own people in the notorious Spanish Inquisition. Now, most of the refugees from Spain and Portugal fled to the Maghreb. And what happened is that a lot of them ended up in a number of city-states, which by the 16th century came to be known collectively as Barbary. These city-states were under the control of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which by the 16th century was the most powerful empire in the world, and the best run as well, I might add. And they were largely run by Turkish soldiers called Janissaries. These were foot soldiers as opposed to cavalry, which were different. But what happened is oftentimes the soldiers were the rulers of the city, and sometimes they would assassinate each other, and another soldier would be set up as the ruler. Now, the Muslims who had fled Spain, and the Jews as well, had enormous anger at being forced out by the Spanish and Portuguese Christians. And this was long remembered. There was much bitterness in the Maghreb because of this. And so many of them started to attack Christian shipping in the Mediterranean, seeking both revenge and profit. And in fact, the Spanish regent in the 1490s, Cardinal Jimenez, actually wanted to bring the Reconquista into Maghreb and impose Catholicism by force over all people of North Africa. The Spanish did in fact seize some Maghreb sites and fortified them, but most of them were later lost. This, by the way, is a typical galley, which has been used for many centuries for warfare and for commerce in the Mediterranean, but mainly for warfare. They can be rather big, as you can see. These are pirate ships. We'll talk about in a minute here. By the 16th century, there was endemic warfare in the Mediterranean, from the 16th to early 19th. Piracy was widespread and had been very ancient in the Mediterranean, and so the religious war continued to cease. This was a matter of Muslims versus Christians, Spanish, Portuguese, the Christians on the island of Malta. Malta being up here. You can see it on that. As well as the Italian states. Now, the piracy increased in the latter 16th and early 17th centuries, and the main lane was European pirates making war on Muslim commerce. And they were trying to stifle Muslim trade in the Mediterranean. Now, piracy at this time was illegal, but it was often winked at because there was a significant religious element involved. Those pirate ships might attack even ships of their own nation if it was their opportunity. What normally happened is that the ships would be captured, the crews would be enslaved, and they would be imprisoned on galleys like this one. These are all rowed by men sitting on benches. There'll be like 4 men to each oar, so there's quite a few men on each galley. One of the major players among the pirates in the Mediterranean is Great Britain and English, and there was much violence on all sides, but as normal and as usual, the Christians tended to be worse. The degree of Christian violence is shown by an incident in 1584 in which an Italian Venetian gallery galley force captured a Barbary ship, a very large ship, and all the people, 340 people, were literally cut to pieces by the Venetians, including the Barbary princes and 45 of the women. In fact, the view of Christians towards Muslims in this period is shown by the fact that in the late 18th century, the word for slave in French was Turk. Now, later on, women were more protected when they were captured rather than put to death, because they were certainly worth a lot more. And they were protected because they were worth more when they were not abused. And by the late 18th century, in Algiers, the largest of the Maghreb cities, women were never publicly displayed for sale. By the way, these are Turks. These are not Maghreb people. They're not Moors. They're Turks. The rulers of these cities. So this chap is obviously part Black African. But ironically, the captains of the Barbary ships, called corsairs, were almost all European Christians who had come to Barbary and either captured or come on their own and accepted Islam. And so it's interesting that the rulers and those who made war on the sea were not the people of the Maghreb primarily, they were outsiders. These are Christian corsairs. If you look at their faces, they don't look very Middle Eastern, but they're wearing Middle Eastern dress. Now, these corsairs, as they were called, actually were not pirates. They were, in fact, privateers, and there's a very significant difference. Privateering was a mode of legal warfare, which piracy is not, which had been developed in the 12th century. And the idea was that if a merchant ship is attacked by enemies, the merchant gets the right from his ruler to attack those enemies in return. And what happens is the ruler gives him what's called a letter of marque or reprisal. Now, this was started by Europeans in the 12th century. And the way the deal worked is that they had the legal right to attack an enemy, whoever that enemy may be, and then they share a portion of whatever loot they get with the ruler, capturing the ship and enslaving the crew and selling them or holding them up for ransom. Now, in the ever-shifting politics of European power at the time period, especially with the wars between Catholics and Protestants in the 16th and 17th century, many Christian powers actually encouraged the Barbary corsairs against Christian rivals. They often sold the warships and naval stores, which the Barbary powers did not have naval stores, they had to import them. Louis XIV, King of France in the late 17th century, actually said, quote, if Barbary did not exist, we would have to invent it. As late as the early 19th century, the English Lord Foreign Secretary Castlereagh wrote, the destruction of Barbary regencies, these city-states were called regencies under the Ottoman Empire, would inevitably result in the creation on the coast of Africa of states united to France, which would destroy our influence in the Mediterranean, and in consequence of our economies. So many Europeans actually wanted the Barbary states to continue privateering throughout this time period. Now, these corsairs were actually very wide-ranging. They went out eventually into the Atlantic when they started copying the larger ships that Europeans were sailing on the oceans as opposed to the Mediterranean. These are some scenes of from Barbary. It's a slave about to be punished. This is a certificate. I'll explain it in a minute. But the Barbary corsairs ranged out into the Atlantic and ranged as far away as the English coast and even the coast of Denmark. And there was a famous raid on Iceland, far away in the far North Sea in 1627. The Europeans often tried to retaliate against the Maghreb cities, but it was difficult to destroy them. The shores close to I should say the waters close to the shores of the Maghreb tend to be shallow, so large ships can't easily sail on them or they'll run aground. And wasn't that easy to blockade these ports from the north, because the problem was that the storms came from the north, and for a sailing ship, that caused real problems. The Corsair ships, the privateer ships, were also very light. They carried limited supplies so they could be as fast as possible, and they had a shallow draft so they could escape with the bigger ships by going in the shallow waters. Even when Europeans bombarded the Barbary ports, the rulers often simply withdrew from the city to their country palace, and were often not so very concerned for the destruction of their subjects and their property. Remember, their subjects were not of the same ethnic background as themselves. In 1628, the French bombarded the city of Algiers. In the Day of Algiers, the ruler of Algiers later asked the French consul what it cost him. And after he heard, he laughed and he said that he would have bombarded the city himself for half that amount. The larger Europeans also aided the Corsairs because they could get more Mediterranean trade. Because the reason they did this is that they would often make treaties with the Barbary ports, who would then pay tribute or would then get tribute or kind of protection money from the Europeans. And the Europeans would pay so much money to them, and then they would in turn not protect their commerce at sea. And it was actually a good deal for everyone because it was cheaper for the Europeans, and it was more convenient for the Barbary Corsairs to simply get tribute instead of having to go out and take the risk of hunting ships. This tribute was actually a counterpart to commercial monopoly or tax. The idea is that if you sail in our waters, you pay for it. The Scandinavian countries viewed this as just an extra cost of trade, like insurance, and they didn't really mind paying. And the notion that is so common today of free trade, which is sort of taken for granted in the 20th century, was actually alien to traditional societies at this time period. It's a modern 19th century concept, and there really was no such thing in traditional societies. Now, privateering was practiced by all countries that had coastlines, including the United States, later on. Whenever nations made war on each other, merchant ships, especially in this time period when navies weren't so big, merchant ships had the right, with whatever market reprisal, to go out and to capture enemy shipping. And English and everyone else did this. And indeed, the word corsair was used for these privateers for all nations. Nowadays, the term corsair tends to be applied only to the Barbary privateers, but in fact, in its time, the word corsair applied to all nations' privateers. In fact, Western historians have labeled the Barbary corsairs and mixed them up with pirates. They've labeled them pirates so often that even Arab historians have come to use this word without knowing what it really is. Jamil Abdel Nasser, in his book, A History of the Maghreb, published by Cambridge in 1975, used the word pirate rather than privateer, as did Abdullah Lori in his book, The History of the Maghreb, published by Princeton in 1977. Apparently, neither was aware that there was a difference between privateering and piracy, because the Europeans had described the Barbary corsairs as pirates so consistently. Now, this is one of the certificates issued to European ships by corsairs, and they carried this on the ship, and the corsairs stopped and they showed them the certificate that corsairs let them sail on. This was standard procedure. These are some scenes from Barbary here. It's also significant that the Barbary rulers prior to turned out being labeled pirates. They felt this was simply the arrogance of the growing power of Western states as the centuries went on. Now, the New World was involved early on in this old frontier conflict between Islamic Christianity and the Mediterranean. And in fact, the conquest of the New World was a seamless extension of the old Islamic Christian frontier, but in a different context. In 1492, when Columbus discovered America, the last Islamic state in Spain went out of fell. In fact, Columbus was nothing more than a military mercenary. And he saw himself as a crusader, no different than the crusaders centuries before. He had the same mentality as them, the same extreme violence was inflicted upon the Native American Indians, the same brutality brutality, massacres, enslavement, etc. And it is significant that Captain John Smith, shown in this 17th century print, was chosen as the leader of the Pilgrims in Massachusetts when they went there in 1620, because he had been a mercenary who had fought on the Balkan-Turkish border against the Turks. In fact, he was captured and has often been called the first American captive of Muslims. And he later escaped, and because he had this experience as a soldier, that's why he was chosen as the military leader of the Massachusetts immigration, or the Pilgrim immigration in Massachusetts. Some more scenes of Margaret. I believe these are Algiers. Now, the American colonies, the first American ship was captured in 1625 by Morocco. Others followed after that. And what's been called the first American naval battle was fought against the Corsairs in the year 1645, in which the Americans won. They lost, they probably would try to forget it. The Corsairs preyed upon the fishermen of the Newfoundland fishing banks, and approximately 700 Americans were captured in all the 17th century. The Americans, however, were active pirates as well. In the 17th century, approximately 1/4 of all the pirates in the Caribbean were from colonial America. And these pirates came from such American ports as New York City, Boston, and Salem, Massachusetts, Charleston, South Carolina, and Newport and Portsmouth, Rhode Island, in addition to other ports. In 1695, 3 American pirate ships, 2 from Rhode Island and 1 from New York City, together with some English pirates, attacked the Muslim Hajj pilgrim fleet from Old India, which was in the Red Sea on its way to Mecca. Later trial testimony noted, quote, the most horrid barbarities were practiced by these pirates upon Muslims. David Cordingley, an authority on the history of piracy in his book Under the Black Flag, writes, quote, all evidence suggests that the pirates embarked on an orgy of rape, torture, and plunder which lasted for several days. Some of these pirates later escaped to the Carolinas, by the way. Later, the infamous pirate Captain William Kidd, a wealthy New York City resident who lived on Lower Manhattan Island, organized a legal privateering expedition in 1797, but he also made a pirate attack on a local Hajj fleet again coming from India, going to Mecca. He had less success, and he was eventually captured and hanged in England for his piracy. These are slaves being brought into Barbary, in a Christian friend, of course. Now, by the late 18th century, modern privateering attacks were in decline. But they couldn't stop because the Corsairs and the Turkish soldiers were revolted that they had. The Christian navies or ships were getting bigger and had adopted a better technology than the old-style Mediterranean vessels. Here's some Christian, larger Christian ocean-going vessels. This is an older print of Algiers. This is Algiers a couple centuries later. The North African states were forced to adopt these larger ocean vessels for their own defense. And the Corsairs also had the problem of increased expenses because they needed even more important naval stores, such as masts and pitch and rope, etc. Now, the Barbary Wars with America started in right after the American Revolution, but during the Revolution, it's most significant. The very first country in the entire world to recognize the independent United States was from North Africa, Morocco. The Emperor of Morocco recognized the U.S. in December 1777, even before France. At the time, however, most modern rulers did not differentiate between the Christians that much, and they knew very little about the United States. Mediterranean Christian countries continued to war on them, and for some Catholic monarchs, such as in Spain and elsewhere, the monarchs in their accession to the throne were actually obligated to never make peace with the Muslims, although some eventually got around by making long truces. But in 1785, the first independent American ship was captured by an Algerian corsair, and some 35 other ships were captured as well later on in subsequent years. The Americans had been protected from the Corsairs because the English had a tribute treaty with the modern states from 1686, or 1686. And American ships were better protected. But after independence came to America, the English encouraged the moderate powers to attack American ships because the English, of course, were angry that the Americans had dared to rebel against their rule. These, by the way, are Xebecs that were used a lot in the Mediterranean. When Thomas Jefferson built the Princeton Navy in the early 19th century, he copied the Xebec style for the early American Navy. Now, President Adams, second President of the United States, paid tribute to Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, but later Thomas Jefferson, well, he'd been opposed to this all along, but later he became president, and he decided a different course. The American Navy was indeed founded in 1794 because of the Algerian conflict. And the slogan eventually was adopted, millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute. Now, this was actually because of a short war, quasi-war that was called with France. It was adopted later when additional war erupted with Barbary powers. In fact, the Bey of Tripoli became envious when he thought Algiers was getting more money than he was in the U.S., and so he started attacking American ships as well. Jefferson, then being president, hated and feared the military as a potential threat to American democracy. But he wanted to establish American national prestige by fighting back against the Corsairs, and so that's what happened. This, by the way, is the American Commodore in an audience with a Barbary ruler. This is the American warship. The Philadelphia. The combat record was mixed, and there was actually very little fighting compared to later wars. In 1804, the warship on the screen in Philadelphia, in the midst of operations, got too close to the shore in Tripoli Harbor and ran aground and was lost by the Americans. The next year, U.S. Naval Commander Stephen Decatur recaptured the Philadelphia, but he couldn't get it off again when he floated, and so he burned it as the Philadelphia burning. The Americans set fire to it. This was hardly a great victory, but the Americans celebrated it as one. There's another print from later 19th century from the burning of Philadelphia. In 1805, here's some combat prints from children's books of the 19th century about the Barbary Wars. Comment on shipboard. The guy with a pistol and a big hat is American, of course. In 1805, the American General William Eaton was sent to capture the Tripolitan city of Derna from the land, which he accomplished with the help of a mixed army of veterans, Greek mercenaries, and a handful of U.S. Marines. And this, in fact, is where the part of the U.S. Marine Corps hid from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, because there were fewer than a dozen Marines involved in this altogether. And these guys here are Marines. That's Eaton. And I believe that's one of the private leaders. That's the guy who wants to be the Dey, or the ruler of Tripoli. His brother was on the throne. The Americans were sponsoring a different leader that would deal with them more than they liked. Eaton's army captured Derna from the sea. That's Eaton down the lower right. And he tried to reform the corruption of the government in the city, and he actually tried to institute a version of democracy. The problem was that he was an absolute ruler, and there was no elections there, but he was recalled before he could really accomplish very much. The guy in the middle is Stephen Decatur of the Philadelphia, and the other is an earlier Commodore Preble. Now, after the War of 1812 was over, the U.S. in 1815 forced moderate powers to accept treaties by sending a larger fleet. And tribute and privateering against American ships was indeed ended in 1816. In that same year, the British and the Dutch mounted a huge attack on Algiers, and privateering diminished dramatically after that until the French captured Algiers in 1830. Now, American attitudes towards Islam are the significant background and effect in part of the Barbary Wars. It was actually much older than that. The word Barbary or barbarian is actually an ancient Greek word that all it means is non-Greek. And the Americans inherited the older European attitude of ignorance towards Islam. Indeed, the first contacts Americans had with Muslims were African slaves, Muslims who had been enslaved in West Africa and brought to America. And the view Americans got tended to be negative because these slaves, for one thing, they couldn't speak English, but to make it worse, when they were grouped together before shipment across the Atlantic, people of different languages were deliberately put together so they couldn't communicate with each other to make a slave revolt on shipboard much more difficult. There's over 200 different languages in West Africa, so it's very easy to do. And thus, the West African slaves were extremely isolated socially. They lost the entire social contact in their lives. They were degraded. The treatment they got was absolutely appalling. And they were very vulnerable. And so Americans tended to get a negative view of Muslims when they actually understood these people were Muslim. On those occasions when they did. The Enlightenment did not benefit the view that America, did not improve the view that Americans had of Muslims either. Islam was increasingly shown as an example of tyranny and suppression of free speech. There were more European travel accounts from the late 17th century available of Islamic countries, but all of these were from a European point of view. There were no Muslim accounts available to counteract them or give a different perspective. In English, the very first biography of Muhammad was published by an anonymous Englishman entitled The Life of Muhammad, or the History of the Imposture, which subjugated a larger portion of the globe than the religion of Jesus as yet set at liberty. This was published in 1702. In this book, Muslims were portrayed as being so debased by fraud and violence and the corruption of their own governments. The Christian missionaries could not help them. These Muslims were so degraded they were simply not interested in being helped. And what did the author conclude? The only thing that can help these Muslims is for them to be conquered and then freed. Freed from their, quote, blasphemy and iniquity. The implication being that they would then be converted to Christianity as well. An earlier biography of Muhammad was written in England by the Anglican Reverend Humphrey Prideaux, entitled The True Nature of Imposture, fully displayed in the life of Muhammad. This was published in 1697, and two American editions were published in the 1790s. This book used Islam as a warning against young people who were inclined towards triviality in their religion. The consequences of Islam were thus religious slavery, and Muhammad was flawed by its ambition in respect to this book. Now, after the Barbary War started with the U.S., interest of Americans in Barbary increased dramatically as ships began to be captured. This, by the way, is the slide is a French story about Barbary captivity. A French book, the French piece of a French book about Barbary captivity. These are some more stirring combat scenes. These are older prints showing the depiction of Christians being tortured and abused by their captors in Barbary. Now, the interest that Americans had in Barbary actually was more about the fears for the potential of despotism in the new American experiment in government than they were actually about a few ships being captured in the faraway Mediterranean. American perspectives on Islam in terms of the writings tend to be very little concerned with accuracy. Americans knew very little about Islam and about the Middle East, and the sources were so limited in story. Indeed, ridiculous claims were made about the conditions in Islam, the condition of Arabs, and in the British Empire. For example, it was believed that Allah had condemned despotism in government, and thus Muslims didn't care about improvements for tomorrow. Islam also was thought to impoverish people because there was no liberty in the Middle East. And what they meant liberty, they meant U.S.-style liberty, of course. In Barbary, Islam, Arabs, and the British Empire became examples of what not to do in government. In the 1790s, for both the conservative Federalist parties and for the liberal anti-Federalists, Islam was an example and held up as what not to do. And it was also held up as an example of what the opposite party did that was bad. The conservative Federalists said that Islam basically was chaotic and unstable. because there were regimes overthrown. And this was the results that would happen in America if the anti-federalists or political opponents got into power. The liberal anti-federalists, on the other hand, said that, well, Islam shows us, and the Maghreb and the Middle East show us, what happens when there is tyranny, and this shows the danger of too much power being held in the hands of the executive. So the idea was that, well, the Federalists are basically inclined towards this evil Islamic sort of government. In an article called The Concise History of the Algerines, there's more nastiness here. Published in the Massachusetts Magazine in 1789, Janissaries were shown as to be the great threat of military despotism by the poor. So these were Federalists saying that, well, the poor people and the mob rising up against us rich people, the example of this is shown in the Janissaries and the Maghreb. When soldiers of lowest origins can kill the ruler and set one of their own up as the ruler. Also, the brutal British and German mercenary soldiers in the American Revolution were compared to the British Janissaries. In a book attacking the French Revolution, future Federalist President John Adams in 1790 referred to, quote, anarchy, insecurity of property, darkness, ignorance, superstition, fanaticism, and a quote, mad despot with the enthusiasm of another Muhammad, unquote, all this being the ultimate consequence of too much liberty, French style liberty, of course. His son, the future President John Quincy Adams, called his political rival Thomas Jefferson, quote, the Arabian prophet, unquote, and referred to the Islam of democracy. And, quote, there is but one balance of liberty and common sense is a prophet. That being the political polemic Common Sense written by Tom Paine before the American Revolution. Islam, therefore, was opposed to true liberty and thus to progress, and this was the reason that the Maghreb and the Middle East was considered backward. Free enterprise was not allowed there by Muslim religious intolerance. So conservatives and liberals both agreed that Islam fostered bad government. It was an inversion of democracy, and everything about it was bad, and Muhammad was made as a symbol of almost anything bad. Now, it's very interesting that when the reality of these, or when reality belied these fantasies and projection fantasies, reports in the American press sometimes repeated these fantasies, but also embellished them. For example, when Bey Hassan of Algiers died peacefully in 1798, the Western press falsely reported that the entire court and the French ambassador had all been beheaded, which was completely untrue. There was thus a tendency for these fantasies to take on life of their own. Now, all this had a very significant effect on American popular culture. 7 Algerian POWs were displayed on the New York stage in 1805, and there were repeat performances because there were huge crowds. Francis Scott Key also wrote a song in 1905 honoring Decatur's 1804 victory in Tripoli, which he wrote 9 years later as the U.S. national anthem. 11 states also named towns after both Stephen and Decatur, and later there were others named for General Lee, and there is a Decatur and Eaton in both Illinois and Indiana. There was a flood of books in the 1790s. There were stage plays, including a stage adaptation of Muhammad the Imposture, which were published every year in England between 1745 and 77, and then performed in Philadelphia in the mid-1790s. There were also other forms of entertainment with Barbary themes, such as panoramas, which is a series of paintings, and there's maybe 100 of them, and you walk through them and look at them. It's kind of like a four-render motion picture in a way. And military themes are very popular in panoramas. There are also pantomimes, which are sort of simple plays. Songs, paintings, novels, poems, and sermons concerned with Barbary. So the Barbary Wars were transformed into a popular culture morality tale. A tale of good guys versus bad guys. And the U.S. sailors were depicted as winning over the evil Barbary pirates because they fought for their love of country. And the Muslims only fought from fear, so naturally they were defeated. Well, this had very little to do with the actual conditions of combat in the Mediterranean, because the fact is that the Corsairs were built for speed to prey on our merchant ships with civilian sailors, and they couldn't stand up to warships. So when a U.S. warship caught a Barbary Corsair, there was no doubt about who's going to win the battle. Well, this illustration, by the way, shows as the caption says, a Christian female captain being abused by Maghreb Moors. Now, all this was also reflected in American travel and captivity narratives. People writing accounts of their own captivity. And these narratives were both bogus and genuine. This followed a much older English tradition of captivity narratives, and also of American Indian frontier captivity narratives, which had emerged as a genre in the 1670s. It's difficult to say in many of these just how much has been accurate, but they often exaggerated bad conditions and suffering to make it look more appealing. Sometimes lurid and very sexual and sadomasochistic appeals are made in these books, including things like torture and rape. And these followed an older English captivity narrative, and the old practice in which slaves in Barbary were encouraged to write letters home to try to get people back home to send them money to pay the ransom for freedom. So the worse they made the conditions sound in their captivity, the more likely people were to cough up money. And indeed, Americans tended to think of Barbary slavery as being like the sort of slavery that existed in the United States, which it was not. I'll discuss it a little bit later. But so important was this in England in the 16th and 17th centuries that collecting money to free captives in Barbary actually became a trade, and people would go around the streets and they would cry out for aid for money to ransom the Barbary captives. So the distortions of the letters and the printed narratives tended to depict Barbary captivity in the worst possible light, and did much to fix the subhuman image of Barbary in American popular culture. Now, the greatest of all of these narratives was James Riley's book Sufferings in Africa, which appeared after the wars ended. This was a bestseller in its day. Between 1817 and 1859, over 1 million copies were sold in the United States. It was also reprinted in 1965. The story was that Riley's ship from Connecticut was shipwrecked on what's called the Skeleton Coast of Africa. It's now the western Sahara on the northwest coast of Africa, south of Morocco. The men were shipwrecked without resources. There's no water in that stretch of the coast. It's drinkable and hard conditions in the desert. And they soon would have died of thirst if they had not been enslaved by local Tuareg Bedouin. The conditions of slavery were extremely harsh because of these desert conditions. And this was not like the sort of slavery that existed in the Barbary ports. But of course, Americans didn't understand the difference. They thought this was a typical example of what slavery was like there. Eventually, in the narrative, the author learned a fair amount of Arabic and came to an understanding with his last owner. His first owner sold it to another one. And they came to respect each other, and he convinced the second owner that if he took him to Morocco to the American consul, he would pay for him and his companions, and then he'd be happy. This book and its influence is symbolized by the fact that Abraham Lincoln, when he was a teenager living in southwest Indiana, noted that this was one of 4 books that he read. And books like this helped to inspire the American anti-slavery movement, trying to abolish slavery in the United States. But there were a few writers in America that actually saw Islam as having virtues over America in terms of slavery. In the 1801 novel that was published and read in upstate New York and Vermont, Humanity in Algiers, or the story of Gaza, an American black slave was freed by a grateful Algerian master and ended up as a businessman, something he could not have done in the United States. Now, this is basically a critique of American Christianity that allowed chattel slavery to exist in the United States. And it depicted the basic perspective that Islam was morally superior to Christianity in conferring more freedom to slaves. Now, one of the few positive statements of early American literature of Islam is being superior to Christianity. This book followed a much older 17th century tradition in literature that viewed Islam as having significant virtues over Christianity. And often Muslims were depicted as being morally superior to Christians in the 17th century as a way of criticizing Christians for ill behavior, just as in the Humanity in Algiers book did. But the prevailing view in America was profoundly negative of Muslims. And it's significant that there was no Muslim voice in America that contradicted this view. Americans simply heard the same thing over and over again. And like my grandfather often used to say, if you tell a lie often enough, it becomes true. Most Americans thus felt that they and the American way of life were vastly superior, especially in moral and ethical superiority to Arab Muslims. And Americans Americans often have a tendency to be archly self-righteous about this. Muslims, after all, practice piracy and brutally enslave people. Now, the Barbary rulers' pride was actually hurt by being accused of piracy because they knew that this was in fact not true. But how true was the self-serving view that the Americans had of themselves? The American naval historian noted that, quote, the so-called Barbary pirates were legally privateersmen in that they had commissions from established and recognized governments. And all European powers at this time still practiced privateering in the early 19th century, as well as the United States. In fact, wartime privateering between Christian powers was not just normal, but was still considered essential. And it was especially considered essential in the United States, which had such a small navy at the time period. And it also had to take on an extremely large British navy in the War of 1812. And privateering was the primary way the Americans could fight back against the British. But there was another dimension of American privateering. It was a great source of wealth as well. Both in the American Revolution and the War of 1812, especially in the port of Baltimore, huge profits were made from American privateering. For merely speaking out against a possible war with England, Revolutionary War Cavalry General Richard Lighthorse Harry Lee, father of General Robert E. Lee, was jailed in Baltimore for his own protection from a pro-war mob. The mob broke into the jail and they beat him up so badly that he never recovered. The U.S. also authorized its own privateering against Algiers in 1815. By 1820, however, President John Quincy Adams intended to abolish privateering by treaty with Britain. But American port cities opposed this, claiming it was necessary to U.S. maritime defense, although they did not stress the high profits of privateering as one of their main arguments in favor of keeping it. In the settlement of the Crimean War in 1856, there was another attempt to outlaw privateering, and the big powers agreed. Britain, France, Russia, Prussia, and Austria-Hungary agreed to abolish it. The British fearing losing the wartime advantage of the neutral Mediterranean ports. But the U.S., Mexico, and Spain did not, because all of them had small navies. Indeed, in the U.S. Civil War, the Confederacy instituted privateering, and privateering was carried out against Union merchant ships. And the federal government, the Union side, also made privateering legal, but they did not actually issue any privateering letters of marque. Probably because there weren't enough Confederate ships at sea, because the Confederate coastline was blockaded by the Union Navy. And privateering was not actually ended until 1907 at the Second Hague International Peace Conference. Now, Muslim privateering has often been viewed thus essentially as the same as piracy, but like terrorism, this is a matter of perspective. In fact, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. The closest 18th century equivalent of this were the American rebels of 1776. Many English, in fact, thought that George Washington and company all deserved to be hanged. But Americans labeled Muslim corsairs as pirates with all the evil trappings of extreme violence associated with assumed to be the norm. But the Americans had their own homegrown version of piracy as well, separate from privateering. And this is the filibusters. People tend to think of the word filibuster as a U.S. Senate tactic in which a senator gets up and he talks for so long that it's not possible for another senator to get up and the time runs out and try to defeat a bill. Well, the word filibuster is actually much older than this. It goes back to the Dutch word, now I can't pronounce the Dutch word beans, but it's something like vrijboeder. This then became the English word freebooter, which means pirate. What the filibusters were, and here's some on this slide here, these were organized private invasions of foreign countries undertaken by Americans and primarily composed of Americans. These were illegal in America, but they happened often. In fact, there were filibuster expeditions invading foreign countries from America, in the Spanish East and West Florida at least twice, into Mexico a number of times, including the Mexican state of Texas 3 times, the Mexican states of Lower California and Sonora, and Yucatan. Canada was invaded once and threatened a second time by privateers in 1837 and 38. The California Bear Republic was essentially a filibuster in 1846. And there were filibusters also sent to Nicaragua, twice to Cuba. This is fighting in Latin America by filibusters. Ecuador, Peru, the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, and El Salvador. To historians, the Mexican War itself, of 1846 to 1848, was the largest of the filibusters, because he said that the U.S. government itself undertook it. Now, the filibusters, some of them were revolutionary mercenaries. They wanted to help local revolutionaries in Latin America against Spanish rule. But for most, the idea of spreading democracy was not to give power to racially and religiously inferior locals. Instead, they believed that these people needed to be protected from, or protected by, superior Protestant Americans. So what usually happened was that the filibuster leader appointed himself president of the country, and his cronies became his cabinet. And then they all proceeded to give themselves enormous land grants. In fact, all the filibusters, even the privates, expected to get wealthy from these military expeditions. This print, by the way, is a caricature from the English publication Punch from 1850. It's called The American Rover's Code for Pirate. American Rover General tried to steal a Cuba. Cuba being Cuban cigar symbolized Cuba. Here's the Spaniard picking the American out. And his costume is interesting. He's got the Southern slave plantation owner's planter's hat. He's got a military coat with big epaulets. The high collar is typical of that period. He's wearing the skirt that sailors wore at sea at that time period. So he's part planter, part soldier, part skirt. And the funny-looking stockings are what clowns wore at the time. He's also holding a pepper box, sometimes called a bowling gun. That's the forerunner of the revolver. He's wearing a sword, of course. Now, filibustering was also a way to expand territory where Southern slavery could thrive. The Southerners were running out of territory where they could grow cotton in the 1830s and 40s. And the filibusters had the greatest success in Texas, which the Americans infiltrated for more than a decade while it was a part of the Spanish Empire and later independent Mexico. This was planned ahead of time. And after being settled, the American immigrants rebelled in 1835 while Mexico was distracted by civil war. The result was an independent Texas. And an assumption on the part of most of these former Americans that it would only be a question of time before they could ask to become part of the United States, which indeed happened in 1846. The Texas filibuster then became the model of inspiration for many other filibusters. And this is shown by the dress of the filibusters in the invasion of Cuba in 1850 from New Orleans. The filibuster soldiers were issued red shirts, red being the revolutionary color, because they didn't consider themselves revolutionaries. And in their hats they wore the Lone Star cockade. Well, a cockade is another version of a badge, but the Lone Star symbol, of course, is associated with Texas, so Texas was shown as their inspiration. And there were many such invasions launched between 1835 and 1860, right after the first American Civil War. Filibusters were completely illegal, but the American authorities didn't seem to be able or willing to stop them. They were rarely caught. When they were put up for trial, juries wouldn't convict them. And the filibuster ships often had more power than the U.S. Coast Guard did. Or more firepower, I should say. Filibusters were organized, quote, with scant restraint from the authorities, quote, unquote, from, quote, several U.S. courts, including New York. New Orleans and Baltimore became notorious for their filibuster expeditions, and the local Baltimore officials were said to be, quote, fanatics for the South American cause, unquote. At least one judge actually gave criminals an option to join the Cuban filibuster, which gave them implicit U.S. government recognition to a legally, privately organized invasion of the sovereign foreign country. Now, the king of filibusters is this guy, William Walker, a southerner from a plantation. He was high-minded, deeply Christian, unstoppable once he made up his mind, and absolutely ruthless. Walker once said, and this gives a good indication of his mentality, quote, "We have suffered more than the pangs of death, the reproaches of a people for whose welfare we stood ready to die." So Walker and the other filibusters just couldn't understand that Hispanic Catholics didn't want to have Greenville Protestants rule them. Now, U.S. piracy also applies to its treatment of the Native Americans, the Indians. Lands were taken from them by swindling and fraudulent treaties on a wholesale after treaty after treaty after treaty that the Americans made with the Indians were fraudulent. The Indians were made drunk, the treaties were in legalese language, the Indians didn't know about lawyers. The Americans told them what the treaty said, and they lied to them. And the Indians did not have authority from their own people to sell land anyway, because they did not have the concept of private ownership of land. It didn't exist among these people. Not to mention the fact that they were paid ridiculously small amounts of money for these so-called land sales. So this was a sort of land piracy. And on the Kentucky-Missouri frontier, there was no justice for Indians. It was illegal for them to testify in court. White juries never sided with them. So whites could and did steal their land, even when the Indians had clear title and adopted white ways as farmers and had witnesses to the crime. This is the way they were treated in the Kentucky-Missouri frontier by white Americans. Killing of Indians was indeed not seen as a crime by many whites. And as we have seen more recently, wars over land are the most vicious of all, because when the indigenous peoples lose their land, they lose everything. They become dispersed and are no longer a people, but merely scattered refugees. Which, of course, the most obvious example being the Israeli Zionists and Palestinians. Now, it's true that the American Indians had a reputation for viciousness towards their enemies. This is often the case. But scalping, that bloody symbol of Indian evil, actually came from 17th century Ireland, where the English used scalps for paying cash bounties on dead Catholics. Now, slavery was the other major horror associated with barbary in the American mind. And white Christians being enslaved by brown Africans was unthinkable to Americans. Yet the U.S., of course, had had slavery since the 17th century. During the Barbary Wars of 1784 to 1815, in fact, slavery was still legal in some northern states like New York and Connecticut. And the New York slave market, the New York City slave market, was of all places on Wall Street, because of course that's where the markets were. In addition to that, captured Barbary corsairs were taken back to the United States and sold as slaves in the U.S. Now, well, this, by the way, is a European print from the 18th century of Barbary achievement. What's so bizarre about this is it shows how Europeans have a tendency to mix up black Africans, Native American Indians, and the people of Barbary. See, the feathers on his head are typical of the way they used to depict American Indians in that period. Now, in the American Old South, slavery was known as a peculiar institution. Slaves often didn't have enough food. Some masters forced Christianity on them, while others repressed slave Christianity because they feared trouble from any sort of enthusiasm, whether religious, musical, or whatever. It was usually illegal for a slave to learn to read and write because they might get uppity. Slaves could not testify in court. Some could moonlight, but it was not a right. In the U.S., then, slaves had no intrinsic legal value as human beings. With no rights, the master could do literally anything to them, torture them, rape them, or kill them. So extreme brutality was not uncommon. And only the loss of the slave's economic value was a prevention against it. Indeed, the rape of another man's slave woman was only legally a trespass. In other words, it was considered the same thing as walking across somebody's land, private property, when no trespass signs were posted, in terms of the degree of it being a crime. Well, this particularly ugly version of slavery developed mainly in the New World. The basic idea was that there would be no legal limit on the way slaves would be treated, reflecting the free enterprise value of maximizing labor to the utmost. Now, by contrast, slavery in the modern world was considerably different. Traditionally, slavery in the Middle East was a way to incorporate outsiders into society. It was seen as better than killing, which was sometimes done in some circumstances in both Europe and the United States. In fact, it's still done in the United States today. There are many very poor neighborhoods where it's not safe to go there if you were not somebody from that neighborhood. The idea was that if the slaves accept Islam after being enslaved in the monogram, or the Middle East, that they would eventually acquire the legal equality that comes with that. And indeed, the modern notion of freedom is very much relative and is very modern. In societies before the 16th century, there was really no such thing as freedom in the modern sense at all. Everyone was caught in a social web of family and community that restricted their options in life. And what really mattered was how much power and wealth each person had. Among Barbary slaves, the treatment of slaves from after their capture when they were landed is considerably different than treatment in the Old South. In Algiers, each captive got a bath with hot and cold running water, a clean towel, clean shoes, slippers, and blanket. The worst treated slaves sometimes did not have enough food to eat in the worst circumstances, but it was relatively easy to steal from them in Barbary cities. Punishments for slaves for crimes were actually lighter than it was for the indigenous people, because slave crimes were considered normal in Barbary, so they weren't given as worse of a punishment. Whereas Americans the other way around. Slaves often had to run the cities in Barbary. It was very difficult to escape, so it was possible to do that. And many of them were free to move around at night as well. Now, some ordinary slaves were treated rather harshly, and some very harshly, with unremitting hard labor. In Algiers, slaves dragged 40-ton stones for harbor defenses. But most of these were the men known as sheep. Hated Spanish soldiers who deserted from the Spanish fortress of Oran further down the North African coast. Now, the Americans tended to think that all captives in Barbary were galley slaves, but this was basically no longer the case. For many slaves in Barbary, in fact, the main problem was they didn't have enough to do. The main problem was boredom. Now, Barbary slaves, unlike America, had basic rights, as they had in the rest of the Middle East and Africa. Any children born from slaves were automatically free, whereas in America, all children born from slaves remained slaves. Though by the late 18th century, some Barbary masters tried to stop their slaves from accepting Islam, because there was a growing emphasis on the importance of trade in money and zero. Slaves in Barbary also could testify in court and could appeal to justice, or appeal for justice to the very highest authority. In Algiers, the custom was that the ruler of the city had to have a hearing for any slave demanding justice, or anybody, slave or not, demanding justice within 24 hours. In fact, one American slave wrote that in the 10 years he was in Algeria from 1785 to 1795, only one slave was executed for a crime. Slaves also had some privileges. In the slave bagnios, or the slave prison quarters, not all of them lived as prison quarters, by the way, some lived in private homes. Catholics were allowed to have chapels in all of these prisons, or slave quarters. They were even allowed to stage religious processions in the streets of Barbary cities. Protestants also could attend services, but since there were so few Protestants in Barbary cities, they were free to attend services in the residences of Protestant ambassadors. All slaves also had the right to buy both food, wine, and inflated prices for money that they earned at night in a crack. Now, they may have to pay a share of the money to their owner, but if they wanted to, they had this option. Americans also tended to be liked by North African migrant people. Why did they like Americans? Because Americans, like Islam, had freedom of religion, which by no means was common in Europe. In fact, the state of Virginia specifically included Muslims in the law establishing religious freedom in 1786, which was written by Thomas Jefferson. The slaves in Barbary also could do much better if they had special skills that were needed. Skills such as medical doctors, shipbuilding, gunners, carpenters, and some artists. In fact, they could get wealthy and they might even do better economically than they would have done back home in America or in Europe. Some even rose to become ministers of state. For example, the man on the left here is James Cathcart. He was captured in the first ship captured by Algiers in 1784. He ended up as the Dey of Algiers secretary. And after 10 years, he owned 7 slave taverns and returned to the United States rich in a ship with a cargo that he owned. The guy on the right is Joel Barlow, who was an American diplomat who went to Barbary. their slaves as they were in the United States. But the best evidence of good conditions in Barbary is that it was by no means unusual for American and other Christian slaves with good prospects who got ransomed to refuse to ransom and to decline going back home and to remain in Barbary because they liked it there. By contrast, Christians did not sell fellow Christian POWs as slaves. Now remember, the Barbary captives were technically prisoners of war. The Barbary states were simply carrying on the war against Christians that they had been doing for centuries. They were just simply doing what they'd always done. But Christians did not sell POWs for war as slaves, but often they would have been better off if they had, because conditions in prisons at this time in Europe and America tended to be horrible and extreme. In the American Revolution, both the English and the American rebels imprisoned POWs on poles. These are demasted, rotting ships with the masthead taken off, and they're just simply used as a big floating prison. And there were about equally bad conditions inflicted by both sides. In the prison ship Jersey in New York Harbor, under the control of the British, no food was allowed until 3 days after arrival for any prisoner. They were always kept locked below without any ventilation whatsoever, which was a torture in summertime, and there was no heat in the wintertime. They were dressed only in filthy rags. Those dying from contagious diseases were shoved together with everybody else, and they were all fed on moldy bread that was full of worms and with putrid oil. And they never got fruit or vegetables in their diet. Indeed, they were described as living skeletons subjected to remorseless cruelty by an American ship captain who served a couple of years there, Captain Thomas Grant. And the English did this deliberately to encourage American POWs to serve in English warships, because they were short sailors. But this was done by both sides, the people of their own religion and the same ethnic background. In addition to this, both American and British common sailors on warships were frequently treated much worse on their own ships than Barbary slaves were. And this is a cat of nine tails used to flog sailors when they did some minor little thing that was earn the wrath of a superior. Now, despite all these facts, the old stereotypes of Barbary have lingered with remarkable resiliency, and writers still refer to Barbary privateers as pirates. Yet similar and considerably worse practices by the U.S. are viewed in a completely different light. Scholars have done so as well, sometimes with viciously, archly self-righteous denunciations. And I'll quote a couple of these from some of the books written by scholars on subjects connected with this. Sir Charles Petrie, in his book King Charles III of Spain in 1971, described them as miserable braggarts, a collection of insolent savages. Dexter Perkins, The History of the Monroe Doctrine, refers to the pestiferous pirates of Barbary. Pestiferous, of course, referring to disease. Marshall Smelser in the Democratic Republic 1801-1815 refers to the Barbary rulers as marine bandits. Luella Hall, in her book, The United States of Morocco, 1776 to 1956, refers to the gangsters of Barbary. And finally, Thomas A. Bailey, an eminent American historian, in his The Diplomatic History of the American People, in 1964, referred to, quote, as ruffianly as a lot of cutthroats as history can offer. They not only enslaved their captives for ransom, but collected large sums of protection money. And I think it's rather odd that U.S. historians would view making money in this way as being so bad, considering the state of business ethics in this country. And while few have acknowledged that such views are inaccurate and distorted, the question remains why such extremely strong negative views persisted. One scholar acknowledged today the Barbary powers acted in a manner exceptionally distasteful of other nations. But why was it so exceptionally distasteful when Europeans who long practiced privateering were still doing so, as well as much worse things, and on an immensely larger scale? Why can Americans swindle Indian lands and be so tolerant of filibuster privacy that was absolutely legal under U.S. law, and presume that U.S. privateering was completely legal and absolutely necessary, while condemning Muslim privateering and long been recognized internationally as practiced by the U.S., English, and other Western nations? And with such vitriolic, nasty denunciations by U.S. scholars as well? Where did all this come from? Some light can be shed on this question by examining the genesis of these views. In the late 16th and early 17th century, Muslims, often referred to as Turks by the English, were often treated in European literature as equals and even superiors to Europeans, as I've noted. The background of century, all of southern Europe was scared to death of Ottoman Turkish attacks. But since the late 17th century, the decline in Turkish power and Muslim power and increase in Western power, based especially on better European technology, especially military, put the Muslims militarily in retreat. Christians established ever more colonies outside of Europe. By the early 19th century, Europe imposed rule over more non-Europeans every decade. And Europe and America had an increase in orientation towards learning and literacy with the Enlightenment of the late 17th and 18th century, which is a major factor in the development of better technology. The classics of ancient Rome, Greece, and Rome also came into vogue, and Europeans convinced themselves that these were their exclusive heritage, and ignored that Muslims had utilized and built on this learning 1,000 years before, and which had indeed formed the essential basis of the Renaissance and later the Enlightenment. Science thus fueled agricultural advances and economic growth, and the growth of cities and population, and industrialization later only brought this effect. The U.S. and Europe also had advances in financial and monetary institutions which further facilitated growth and expansion. So for Europeans and Americans, now the widespread attitude of "we are in charge" came to be dominant. We colonize other countries. We are not colonized by them. Europe and American societies were thus becoming more regulated, U.S. and European societies were also becoming more regulated and thus violent in this era, thus making it easier to be morally indignant about non-Christians and their violence. Though despite the growing wealth of the West, extreme poverty continued in both the U.S. and Europe, so the adoption of more regulation did not necessarily make everyone's lives better by any means. But Western indignation about conditions in other lands was also especially appealing if those peoples had wealth that could be taken over. Modern racism also emerged in this period in the latter 17th and 18th centuries. And this was a parallel emergence in Europe and America of racism against supposedly inferior peoples everywhere, who were not just disliked now because of having different religions and culture, but were now also considered inferior on every level. This considerably aided in the development of the mentality of superiority and reinforced it, and thus compounded hostility and contempt towards Muslims and other peoples too. I thus argue that all these factors tended to forge a deeply held double standard. Americans and Europeans can privateer and enslave without any moral or ethical taint because we are superior to Muslims in every way. And this mentality is considered continued strong ever since. Americans have made the assumption from the early 17th century Calvinist pilgrims in Massachusetts of their presumed superiority as God's chosen people, who he commanded to found his new Zion in the wilderness. This was very widespread among Americans ever since that time period. And U.S. Christianity has been strongly imprinted with this Calvinism. And under Calvinism, there's essentially only two groups of people, the saved and the damned, those who go to heaven and those who have to go to hell. But later American versions of this emerged. The good and the bad, the superior and the inferior, and the rich and the poor. All this, therefore, tended to feed American greed. As a U.S. military historian has noted of early 19th century America, the prominent American attitude of national self-righteousness in combination with ambition transformed into grants from heaven. Americans thus convinced themselves that God had decreed from the time of the creation that America was destined to become Zion, his own special place on earth, and that America then had the divine obligation to give the entire world freedom too. From the 1830s, American missionaries were sent out to the Middle East, Africa, and much of the rest of the world. U.S. conquest swept across the North American continent in the 19th century and then expanded beyond the shores of the Pacific Ocean. The United States finally colonized Muslims in the southern Philippines, which was an American colony from 1898 to 1946, and then continued as a client state since then. By the way, these chaps up here, this is the only uniform, I think, that exists. This is an official American uniform that includes a Muslim vest. These guys are constables of the Filipino constabulary under American colonial rule. This is the alternative uniform, which is worn by non-Muslims with the brimmed hat. Muslims living in the United States, both with the emergence of the indigenous black Muslim movement and also Muslim immigrants. But now the big oil and U.S. increased domination over much of, if not the whole world. From the 1830s, there now exists a whole new context. I'll read that again. Now with big oil and U.S. increased domination over much of, if not the whole world, after the 1830s, there now exists a whole new context and motivation for these old prejudices. Old distortions of this acquire new and more useful meanings, clearly most benefiting those who promote a predatory foreign policy. Did Al-Qaeda attack us because they are jealous of our freedom, as Mr. Bush said, or because there are over a dozen U.S. military bases in the Middle East with others in neighboring regions which impose a literal military domination over that part of the globe? As long as Americans continue their ignorant, distorted, racist, and hypocritical views of Muslims in this latest crusade for wealth and power, war, insecurity, and large-scale suffering will continue. I'm going to turn this off. Any questions? Yeah.
Do you have somewhere like online where we can?
I'm sorry, would you?
Do you have somewhere online where we could either learn more about this or kind of get a copy of what?
Well, actually, what we had planned to do was to put the lecture online, and what I would like to do is I have a short bibliography, well, it's about 2.5 pages, of various books that I use in doing research for the lecture, and I'll give you some idea of stuff that's out there. A brand new book has come out on the United States and Barbary, called Sam and Barbary, A Diplomatic History. It came out last month. It's published by the University of Florida Press. It was written by a former American ambassador in a couple of Middle Eastern countries named Richard Parker. I got a copy the other day, and I've got like 20 pages left to read in it. But it's a fairly narrowly focused diplomatic history. But there are histories of the Maghreb, and this involved many different subjects, of course, in these lectures. So, but this perspective that I'm giving really is something that no one, I'm almost certain no one has attempted to bring all this information together in this way before. I don't think too many people who do research on North African history look at American Indians and filibusters and so on and so forth.